Yeah, I'm going to talk about psychographic targeting in political campaigns. Psychographic meaning using personality and behavior to target ads at specific groups of people. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the title of the talk in a couple of slides, but let me explain how we got into this research and this particular talk. So in 2016, we did some research into the EU referendum, or some of you might know as Brexit. We did 6 studies consisting of about 11,000 participants, and we looked at personality differences, difference in numeracy skills, thinking styles, and cognitive biases. And in 3 of those studies, we added a question around can you all hear me? I guess. Closer. Wow, I'll probably be eating it. But okay, so in 3 of those studies with about 5,000 people, we added an additional question that's asked people's opinions as to how much they agreed on the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument. So if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. And what we saw in that research was that people who voted to leave the European Union were much more likely to support the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument than those who voted to remain. So we wanted to study that in greater depth to understand kind of what was going on there and understand a little bit more about the drivers. Then in around January of this year, some of my friends started pointing out articles like this, which appeared in Scout.ai, and this is where we got the title of the talk from, really. They introduced it as the rise of the weaponized AI propaganda machine, so using psychographic information in political campaigns. So my friends weren't the only people who were beginning to sort of question the efficacy of, how well does this work, essentially. Other journalists started looking at that and saying, well, does this really hold water or not? So we've got a little bit of background in this topic. In 2013, we presented at DEF CON on predicting susceptibility to social bots on Twitter. So seeing which users would interact with a social bot based on their Twitter activity, and we also looked at personality in that. In 2011 and in 2012, we'd looked at determining personality through Facebook activity and through Twitter. Both of those were presented at DEF CON also. So what we decided to do was using attitudes to online surveillance or digital rights, use that as like the central thesis for exploring the efficacy of psychographic marketing in political campaigns. So the rest of the talk is structured into 5 main sections. First of all, we look at why people are divided. Then we move on to what influences their views, what nudges them sort of one way or the other. Then we look at, once we understand how people are divided, assuming they are, which, spoiler alert, they are, how can you effectively target groups with differing attitudes in relation to online communication surveillance? Once we know how we can target different users, or different people, essentially, we look at how persuasive are targeted ads. And then finally, we wrap up with looking at, okay, once a message is out there, how effective, how able are you to sort of debunk misleading information or misinterpretable information once it gets out of the gate? So on to the first question, looking at why people are divided. Well, we chose the nothing to fear, nothing to hide argument, but we could have chosen the death penalty, we could have chosen the topic of same-sex marriage, and we could have chosen the topic of immigration. So what seems to be at the center, or at least a major factor in all of these differing worldviews, is something called authoritarianism, which began as a study in following the Second World War, but lost some favor or some credibility in those early years and has regained credibility in more recent years, in the last few decades, essentially. So authoritarianism, as you look at it, you might be forgiven for thinking it's a bimodal distribution with people either low or high and not a great deal in the middle. But what we actually find is that it's a much more skewed distribution than that, at least in the Facebook samples that we see. So what characterizes authoritarianism is that people higher in authoritarianism tend to see the world in sort of black and white, whereas people lower in authoritarianism tend to see it in sort of shades of grey, really. And it's a sliding scale, so it's very rare to have people at certain extremes, essentially. People who are higher in authoritarianism are more concerned about the upkeep of societal norms and traditions, whereas people lower in authoritarianism are more embracing of new cultures, new ideas. So the footloose image there. Additionally, what we see is that those who are higher in authoritarianism have lower tolerance for out-groups, whereas people who are lower in authoritarianism are much more embracing of different cultures or different races and what have you. So the scales that we use throughout our studies stem from some work by researchers called Feldman and Sumner in 1997, where they developed a very simple way of looking at authoritarianism. They developed a 4-question, if you like, child-rearing questionnaire. So if you select answers to these questions, which you have to select one or the other for each of the line items, if you're predominantly choosing answers on the right-hand side, then you're higher in authoritarianism than people choosing answers on the left-hand side. Generally, there's some exceptions to that. So moving on to our study and our results for the first thing of looking at why people differ, we chose authoritarianism to look at in greater depth. We conducted 4 different studies from February to May with differing sample sizes. You'll note that there's studies A and studies B. There's a slight difference in the studies. All of the questions, all of the studies took basic demographic information, age and sex, and they asked a number of questions about people's attitudes to online surveillance, which we essentially replicated from prior studies or prior surveys so that we could actually go back and reference and see if our numbers were sort of consistent. The difference between studies B and A was that the B studies also contained a numerical question, which we'll get to a little bit later in the presentation. Because the studies differed, we treat them kind of individually as well. We don't group them with one exception. So we had about 2,400 people took part in those surveys, which we ran through Facebook. So the questions we asked were, how much do you agree? And it was a binary choice. The binary choice in the question stemmed from work from Professor Hetherington and Elizabeth Shuhei, who had previously looked at authoritarianism in American politics in 2011. So we wanted to try and replicate some of their work. So the you have nothing to fear, do you agree or disagree with you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to, you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. So that was the question to replicate our EU referendum work. Then the next question was, it is acceptable that law enforcement agencies have the right to access the content of citizens' online communication without a warrant in order to investigate terrorism. That question was from the Hetherington study. Then the next question we ask is, it is acceptable that immigrants and visitors from potentially dangerous countries should have to reveal their social media account passwords to UK border agents. So we used the UK sample set, but you can do this on a US sample set too. The next question, which came from a survey on attitudes to privacy in 2016, was simply the darknet should be shut down. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but it comes from a survey. So we wanted to, it gave me a chuckle, so we added that in. And the final question we asked was, companies should not be allowed to develop technologies that prevent law enforcement from accessing your online conversations. And that came from that same privacy survey. So going back to our surveys, I mentioned that we treat them differently because there were different studies B and A were slightly different, so we treat them different statistically. The other thing that happened was that in March, late March, there was a terrorist attack in London So what we wanted to do was, well, see what the effect was of the terrorist attack to attitudes to online surveillance. And there's been previous work in that space. Researchers have looked at differing attitudes before and after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. So what we see from the results of surveys A1 and A2, the ones without the numeric question, is that for most of the questions, you get around a sort of a 30%-ish agree with the statement. Only one of those was statistically different before and after the attacks, and that was the sort of the banning the anti-surveillance technology question. The rest, while it looks like there's a visual difference, or there is a visual difference, we didn't see a statistically significant difference between opinions. The thing that interested me or fascinated me the most about the results was that there was, more support for shutting down the darknet. People just want to shut that sucker down, essentially. So in looking at studies B1 and B2, which were the B2 study was conducted 41 days after the attacks, we see that there's almost no difference in opinions from before and after. So the opinions sort of drop off after the terrorist attacks in those surveys. So we see broadly the level of support there hovers around 30%, and we'll get to that a little bit more in the presentation. So looking at the role of authoritarianism in these attitudes, when we look at the nothing to hide, nothing to fear question in particular, we see somewhere between a 1.5 to a 2.5 times increase between those who agree with the statement being more authoritarian versus those who disagree with the statement. We also performed logistic regression, essentially, to look at plotting the odds and some other statistical methods, and we find the same differences, broadly through all of them. In terms of the other questions, we see sort of broadly similar results as well around wiretapping, shutting down the darknet, banning anti-surveillance technology, and extreme vetting. So we see consistently, not just across the questions, but also between all of the different age groups and sexes, that these opinions tend to be fairly consistent. So, assuming that authoritarianism is more of a constant, what is it that can influence people's differing views? So it's said by a gentleman called Bob Altemeyer, who developed what was called the right-wing authoritarian scale in 1996, that authoritarians are characterized as being like 10 steps closer to the panic button. So we sort of plot that on this graph and show the blue line as essentially the baseline of support for surveillance. And then there are two streams of research that have looked at this previously. The first stream of research by Feldman and Stenner had essentially argued that the perception of threat increases support among those who are higher in authoritarianism. So the folks at the higher end of the scale there are going to support it more if they are more concerned about the threat of terrorism. Another stream of research by Hetherington and Suhey in 2011 found that threat increases support among those lower in authoritarianism. So people at the high end didn't really change their opinion if something, if they perceived the threat to be high, but those much lower were more likely to adopt an authoritarian position if they perceived the threat to be high. The researchers that looked at the differences in before and after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, looked at this and suggest that both are partly right, and that it's anxiety that's responsible for causing the uplift in those who are lower in authoritarianism if they are concerned about the threat of terror, versus anger in people higher in authoritarianism if they perceive the threat of terror to be high. So in the study that we conducted, what we'd done in all of the studies, we had a question that simply asked, how worried are you that you might personally become a victim of a terrorist attack. And that was coded, people could answer in 4 ways, from I'm not worried at all to, yeah, I'm very concerned. And that replicates the work from Hetherington and Suhey. So what we did was we used a logistic regression, essentially replicating Hetherington's work, plotting the probability of support for each of those questions against authoritarianism, and then looking at the effect of people's perception on threat. So Hetherington and Suhey's work, I figured I'd add this, so sorry about the bad quality photo from Hetherington's book, but here you can see the effect that he was talking about. Essentially, people lower in authoritarianism, you see that the support really increases from about 25% of support on their wiretapping question to about 75, 80% probability of support. And you'll see at the higher end of authoritarianism, there's really not a great deal of difference. So in our studies, in terms of the nothing to hide, nothing to fear question, we see essentially a similar sort of effect happening to what Hetherington and Suhey found. So going from about an 18% probability of support for those who are not concerned and are low in authoritarianism, that jumps to about a 60% level of support. But there's not many in that category. And at the higher end, there's almost no difference. Looking at all of the other questions, at least for wiretapping and banning anti-surveillance tech, we see similar sort of trend going on. I'll talk about extreme vetting and shutting down the darknet shortly. So extreme vetting is an anomaly, but Hetherington had seen that seen a similar sort of interaction in one of his other questions. So that needs more analysis, but I didn't want to shirk away from calling that one out. The other thing which interested me was that here you see reflected the high level of support for shutting down the darknet, and you see how that jumps up even from a medium high, very high level. You see the interactions, so that if people are concerned about the threat of terror, there's broad support for tackling the darknet. So okay, now we've looked at how people differ around the disposition of authoritarianism, and we can see the role that perception of threat has on people's attitudes. Now we look at, okay, how can we target those different groups of people? How can we target people who are low in authoritarianism versus people who are high in authoritarianism? So essentially, a lot of researchers looked at the relationship between age, sex, geography, Facebook interests, Facebook activity and such like, and personality. What we want to be able to do here is almost get personality. In our case, we use authoritarianism, put it through a function and get the age, sex, geography, and Facebook interests that are going to be most closely associated with people either low or high in authoritarianism. So if you like, we create 2 buckets, one bucket there for low authoritarian and one bucket for high authoritarian. So on to the study and our findings. First of all, tackling age and sex. What we saw in the EU referendum studies was that the difference between female voters who voted to leave or remain in the EU had a much closer level of authoritarianism. There wasn't a great deal to separate them, and indeed looking at the results, there were very low percentages of females in the 18 to 35 age group who wanted to leave the EU. We also saw that reflected in the studies that we'd looked at here with regards to the nothing to fear, nothing to hide arguments online communication surveillance. You'll see that as females get older, the difference extends, so there is a starker difference, and that gets more consistent with males. And for males, there was differences at every age. So in terms of the buckets that we created, and we created these buckets so that we could add them into the Facebook advertising audiences, we have the low authoritarian groups of males of any age, but females only if they're under 35. And for the high authoritarian category, we use males of any age and females who are 35 and over. So that's our simple age and sex classification. And it is, relatively simple, but as we see, it becomes quite effective. So for geography, Renfro and other researchers have looked at regional differences in personality. These are maps of the United Kingdom, and the letters at the bottom reflect what's called the Big Five of personality. So you've got openness to experience, which is strongly correlated with creativity, conscientiousness, which is more concerned about some of the traditions and what have you, or correlates with that. We've got extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So he's looked at different areas with a very large sample set across the UK and found different regional differences. He's also done that with the United States as well, so if you're interested in those regional differences, you can check that out. So he's presented a lot of results and findings for each of about 300 different local area districts in the United Kingdom. So what we did is we mapped authoritarianism to the Big Five using some meta-analysis from researchers Sibley and Duckett. And in terms of authoritarianism, it's classified, or high authoritarianism is classified by higher degrees of conscientiousness and lower degrees of openness mostly. There was a slight difference in neuroticism, but we can pretty safely ignore that. So for our research, what we did, we plotted openness on the openness here, but we reverse it, so we get low openness essentially against conscientiousness. And then we take the results from Renfro's study of over 300 areas in the UK, and we plot them on a graph that's a little bit like this. So you get the high authoritarians to the top right-hand corner, and you get the low authoritarians towards the bottom left. And since it's a hacker conference, it's quite interesting that the least authoritarian place in the United Kingdom is a place called Hackney in London. And I didn't make that up for the talk, but so we chose some towns that were most likely to be, in our opinion, high authoritarian, and some towns and cities that were most likely to be low in authoritarianism. We also looked at how many people were there for reach and stuff like that. So we had some other characteristics that we looked at. And the towns that we chose for low authoritarian were towns that most of you have probably heard of: Cambridge, Liverpool, Edinburgh, and now you've all heard of Hackney. And in the high authoritarian town, we've got high authoritarian districts. We've got places like Basildon and Thurrock and Mansfield and Swindon. You might have heard of Swindon if you like the game like my son does, The Amazing Frog, and Pungence's YouTube channel. Other than that, I'm not sure that any of those towns are that famous outside of the United Kingdom. So now we've got a bucket for age and sex, and we've got the regions that we're going to use in our Facebook advertising. And incidentally, the results that we found using just a simple logistic regression were actually really good at correctly classifying the EU referendum vote. And we did the same thing when we looked at the regional differences in the US and predicting the recent election that you guys had. So on to Facebook interests. There's a tool here called the preference tool that's available to researchers, where you use like slider bars, if you like, to put in different effects of personality, and that shows you some of the Facebook interests that those groups use. Now, we did not use the preference tool because it's available only to researchers. And we didn't need to do that really, because we looked at some of the Facebook interests that we already knew were highly correlated with authoritarianism and low authoritarians. So the low authoritarian category, we chose just simply the interest of liberalism, which is a Facebook interest, and the Guardian newspaper, which I guess is similar to your Washington Post, I guess. For the high authoritarian category, we chose conservatism and the Mail Online. I'm not sure what the equivalent US newspaper is. So somebody shouted something now, but I didn't hear it, so that's it. But so the baseline we've got to beat, if you like, is the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument. We had a sort of a baseline of 38% support for that particular argument in the studies that we use in this sample set. For the targeted audience, just based on age, sex, and geography, we saw a drop from 38% to 32%, but it wasn't statistically significant. And we saw an uplift in support for the high authoritarian towns from 38 to 46. When we added the Facebook interests in that we looked at for the correlation to authoritarianism, we saw that we started to get significant results, although for the first group it was relatively low, possibly due to the overall skew towards low authoritarianism anyway. So from 38% agreement with the argument to 25 is not bad for a very simple experiment. And in the high authoritarian category, we're adding in personality, we see the jump go from 38% to 61%, which was highly statistically significant. A quick note on the significance is that if I'm doing this in the wild, I might not be so interested or worried about P levels and stuff like that. If I consistently see the results like that, maybe I'll just take a gamble on it anyway, and it might give me a sort of a higher return on my advertising investment. So, okay, we've seen the differences in personality, and we've seen how we can target different groups based on just some simple factors that enable us to reach audiences with significantly different views on online communication surveillance. But now we want to turn to, well, what about persuasive ads and targeting of ads? So this is Alexander Nix from Cambridge Analytica, and he states, and this video is online, if you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So there's been some research in this space. This study by Hirsch, Kang, Bodenhausen, they created 5 separate telephone ads that were designed to appeal to different levels of the big 5 of personality. So this is the ad that they used, or at least this is the text that they used in an ad that was aimed at extroversion. With X-phone, you'll always be where the excitement is. And then for neuroticism, they have stay safe and secure with the X-phone, and they always saw statistically significant differences. Matz, Popov, Kaczynski, and Stilwell did a similar thing, looking at aiming ads towards introverts and extroverts for beauty products, and they saw that indeed targeting those ads based on personality had a significant effect on their click-through rates, so the return on advertising investment. So moving on to our study and results, what we did, we had ads that were aimed at people in the high authoritarian bucket and ads that were targeted at people who were in the low authoritarian buckets. And we split that into to ads that are designed to be pro-surveillance and ads that are designed to be anti-surveillance. So the first ad for pro was really appealing to the high authoritarian category as terrorists don't let them hide online. So hopefully invoking some anger there. And for the low authoritarian group, we tried to highlight that there was more than just terrorism online, and we had the tagline, "Crime doesn't stop where the internet starts." I know it's cheesy, but the thinking was that people would look at broader crimes like human trafficking and child exploitation. So for the low authoritarian group, with the anti-surveillance message, we used the image of Anne Frank, and we said, do you really have nothing to fear if you've got nothing to hide? And for the high authoritarian group, we used an image of the D-Day landings, appealing to the authoritarian characteristics of affiliation with military and respect for elders. So those were the ads we categorized, and then in looking at the results of those ads, we reference them here, and these are the self-reported levels of authoritarianism in people that took part in our surveys or samples to rate the ads. So they were asked a bunch of questions like, how much do you like the ad, how much does the ad resonate with my beliefs, how persuasive is the ad, how likely am I to click like or share on the ad, that kind of thing. And we split that then in people's self-reported groups. So this was actually where the persuasiveness of the ad is rated, and that is what people's levels of authoritarianism were classed as. So high, medium, and low. Okay. So the performance of the high authoritarian ad, we see that people who are high in authoritarianism like the ad much more than people who are like medium and low. And when we move to the ad for the low authoritarian group, we see people who were high still like it. It's kind of bought in because they'd be more pro-surveillance anyway. But we see then an uplift in or the expected uplift in the low and medium, or we see an uplift in the low and medium authoritarian categories. So the ad seems to be having the sort of desired effect, if you like. For the low authoritarian category and anti-surveillance, we see kind of a reversal of the high pro ad, where people who are low in authoritarianism like it and people who are high don't like it so much. When we target the ad towards, or when we created the ads for the high authoritarian group, we see a similar sort of uplift to the one we got in the top right-hand corner. And there's a broad level of increase of support from those medium and high. So that's people's responses to how much they like the ad, and then we took it a step further and tested it in the wild with Facebook ads designed, or actually they were Facebook posts, and we used the boosting in the Facebook advertising to appeal to those different audiences. So here we see the Facebook target audiences of high and low authoritarian. There's only two groups there from our target audience, and then the ads in those boxes relate to the ads that we just saw. So what we do for this, using the Facebook advertising essentially, is then look at the click-through rates, or actually this is really the ratio of likes and shares by the level of reach for each ad. So the numbers look pretty low, but actually those are fairly consistent with click-through rates that you'd expect. So for the ad aimed at the high auth group, we see that, as expected, people who are high in authoritarianism like the ad, people who are low think it sucks. In the low authoritarian ad, there was a lot less traction altogether. And Facebook gives you forewarning. It basically says that, ads that have got a lot of text do less well. You might want to consider changing your ad. But what I draw your attention to, at least, is that there was an expected difference in the sort of the correlation coefficient, if you like. So the gap reduces between the low and high. So if we move on to the low authoritarian ads for anti-surveillance, we see the expected results that people in the low authoritarian target like the ad or interact with the ad much more than those in the high authoritarian, or more than those in the high. But then what we see for the ad that's targeted at people in the high authoritarian, designed to appeal to people who are high in authoritarianism and anti, we still get a lot of people who are low in authoritarianism like it, because they like the message of, they don't like online communication surveillance or the idea of it, but people higher then support it a lot more. That was kind of surprising to us. We thought we'd actually get more of a backlash from those groups rather than the interaction. So again, we see that the correlation coefficient reduces as we'd have expected from the ads. But some of you might be thinking, okay, well, that's well and good. We've seen how much people like and click on ads, but does persuasion actually work? You haven't actually told us that. Fair comment, I haven't. And there's very little research into that. But this research by researchers at the University of Mannheim in Germany, Jungher, Wuttke and co., what they did is they took people's attitudes to transatlantic trade, and the sample set was large. It was about 8,000 people. And then they sent some of them some ads explaining it, or some literature about the benefits of transatlantic trade. And they found that over the baseline, which is the zero line, the control of people who didn't receive the literature, they found that people became much more supportive after of transatlantic trade after they'd received the literature. And they looked at the differences in opinions shortly after receiving the literature, and then some time after. And they did notice a drop-off in the time, but so it suggests that if you're wanting to get persuasive material out there, then time is of the essence. So okay, now we've seen, you can get the message out there, but what if the message is erroneous? So how would you go about sort of debunking propaganda? Well, to this, it's not really how we go about debunking, it's what are the challenges of debunking propaganda. So for this, we turn to some research from Professor Dan Kahan at Yale University. He divided participants in his experiment into 4 categories, A, B, C, and D. For categories A and B, he gave them a numerical question about how well skin cream does at treating a rash. And he gave them a number grid which looks like this. So Group A received this number grid and were asked to say, okay, did skin cream essentially make the rash better, or did it make it worse? And people had to go figure that out. Whereas Group B, the text was slightly changed, but the numbers remained the same. So the rash gets better or the rash gets worse. What they found is that people did roughly the same, had roughly the same ability to answer the question. But when he changed the question to one about does gun control reduce or increase crime, he found that people's ideological beliefs really hampered their ability to answer the question. And I'll demonstrate that because we replicated Kahan's study in our EU referendum work, but we changed the question from one of gun control to one about immigration increasing or decreasing crime. So here we see how people do at the skin cream ad, if you like. So broadly consistent, just under 60% getting it right in the referendum result, leave versus remain. But when we ask about does immigration decrease crime, people who voted to leave were just not having any of that and were unable to answer the question, or their performance tanked, essentially. Whereas people who voted to remain, their performance answering the question actually increased. Then when we switch it to immigration increases crime, then the leave voters start doing better again, but the remain voters' performance tanks. And the research that he's conducted is termed ideologically motivated reasoning, and it was dubbed in one article the most depressing brain finding ever, which I liked. And this study was from a little while ago, but it's pretty exciting. He's got a webpage which you go check out called the Cultural Cognition Project, and it's well worth a read. So in our study, we sort of replicated that research again, but we used the attitudes to online surveillance. So in the skin cream ads, we see similar sort of trends between those who agree and disagree with the nothing to fear, nothing to hide argument. But then when we suggest that surveillance actually increases the threat of a terrorist attack, then those who agree with the statement, their performance drops quite significantly, whereas those who disagree, their performance drops a bit. And I'd suggest that the performance drops a bit because the numerical question is actually, the text in it is actually harder to read than it was for the immigration and gun control. When we switch to surveillance actually does decrease the threat, then we see the interaction reverse, although not as starkly as we did in the immigration campaign. We had a sample set of 1,500. So we see the same sort of interaction, just not as starkly. However, the interaction does seem to increase as people get older. So you see a more significant result as people get over 35, and here we just show 44 and over. So in terms of wrapping the talk up, what we're seeing is that authoritarianism plays a part in why people differ, or why their opinions differ. We found that the perception of threat plays a part in actually influencing or nudging people from a baseline position to a different position. We found that we're able to actually target people with different attitudes to online surveillance just by using some simple knowledge about the psychological traits associated with authoritarianism. We find that the persuasiveness of ads does indeed seem to work, and that challenging or tackling misleading information is going to be a very challenging problem because people's ability to interpret evidence essentially becomes a lot harder if it goes against their existing beliefs. So a question I received recently was, okay, well, if both sides are using this, do the effects equal each other out? And I thought about that and thought, well, yeah, in theory they sort of do, or could do. But there's another potential theory is that it's possible that one side has a home team advantage, essentially. So one of the ways they'd have a home team advantage is, well, if you've got momentum on your side, then you can go with that and just like double down on it. So here we see the shutting down the darknet question and the level of support for it. Well, if you just go with that and just increase the already existing fears that people have, it's going to be a lot harder to be in the defense to defend that argument than it is to attack the argument, if you like. There's also the role of fear. So if you've not seen it, there's a great video online by Dee Madigan on propaganda, and Dee Madigan is a Australian campaign advertiser and does a really fantastic talk. And she talks about the effect of fear-based advertising, and she says, people have said that, or said to her that negative campaigns really suck and they don't work on me. And her comment was essentially that, yes, negative campaigns do work, and that's why we do them. Something like that, anyway, paraphrasing. But the fear actually, or increasing fear, works. And we've seen some studies on that as well from Brader in 2005 that shows how political ads motivate and persuade voters based on emotion. And people have higher attention for ads that create more fear, if you like, and use sort of grainy black and white images versus ads that have a lower versus ads that use pictures of smiling children, if you like, in front of flags and all of that kind of good stuff. So people's attention is drawn to the more negative ads in the first place. So, okay, some thoughts on how folks might, or how society might begin tackling the problem. One of the things, and we saw the effect of cognitive biases in the EU referendum research that we've done, and that research we're going to be talking about at the International Conference on Political Psychology in October. And have teamed up with some researchers at Missouri State to help us tackle the challenge of extremely non-normal data. But one of the ways we can tackle this is, or tackle the effect of cognitive biases, is perhaps adopt a method that this lady here, Jane Elliott, had used. And if you're not familiar with Jane Elliott's work, she basically splits participants, it was children in a classroom, but she's done this with other group, into people with blue or brown eyes, and uses that as the basis for helping educate about racism and the effects of racism and kind of how that works. So it's possible that you could do something similar in relation to cognitive biases to make people aware of that, which will have benefits outside of the political campaigns to prevent people getting hustled at car dealerships and stuff like that. The other thing we noticed is that levels of numeracy were really shockingly poor in the UK, and I don't think the US is a great deal better. So increasing people's numerical literacy skills, as being able to determine that 1,000% APR is a bad deal on a credit card. But it also has effects it also has effects in people choosing like medical options and whatnot as well. So there's a lot of research actually in that area of risk literacy in like making medical-based choices. So that needs increasing, I think, all around as well, in addition to the biases. And the next thing, which I think is going to be a lot harder to achieve, because literally anyone can do this. If you've got big pockets, you're going to get a lot more traction, is really start enforcing or going after people who are abusing this sort of political advertising. So that wraps up the presentation. I'm sure folks will have questions. You can reach me at chris@onlineprivacyfoundation.org. I'm happy to address questions afterwards, but we'll have to go outside somewhere, I think, and I'll leave some cards on the table if folks have questions. All right? Thanks very much.